So good morning, everyone. I hope that we can start already. It's a straight 10 o'clock. So I would like to very warmly welcome to RADPol policy event titled Sharing the Insights on Central and Eastern Europe Approaches in Radicalization and Violent Extremism. So now we are starting the first panel, the first expert panel, which will be focused on the current trends on radicalization in the Central and Eastern Europe. So before giving the floor to the panelists and before the introducing myself, I would like to mention a few housekeeping rules. First of all, our panel will take in total 1 hour and 15 minutes. It means 45 minutes for all presentations and 10 minutes by each presentation. And this session will be followed by 15 minutes long questions and answer session dedicated to the participants. I would like to ask the audience to ask the questions after each presentation. You can find in this GoToWebinar panel the special section titled Questions, and you can use it and, as I said, ask the questions after each presentation. Moreover, you can find all presentations which are downloaded in a handout session, which can be found by you as well in this GoToWebinar panel. After the webinar, I would like to kindly ask you to give us the feedback from the webinar. You can do it by completing the feedback survey. Consisted of 4 short questions, so it will take not more than 1 minute to complete it. So I would like to ask all participants kindly to fill this survey. And the last thing is that our webinar is recorded, so it will be available together with the other materials at the RADPol website in the section called Downloads. So in the beginning, I would like to introduce myself. So because I have a great honor to be moderator of this first panel of whole policy event planned for today. And I will be moderating the discussion about the current trends on radicalization in Central and Eastern Europe. My background is, as you can see on the slide, I'm the expert in the prevention of radicalization. I cooperate actively with Polish Platform for Homeland Security. However, I have also Polish background because I was serving as a police officer for Polish police for 18 years. Currently, I work for European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training, which is placed in Budapest. However, actively, I still cooperate with the Radicalisation Awareness Network, and additionally, I'm involved in the scientific work in the area of sociology of security. One additional sentence why, and the kind of explanation why we are focused today on the current trends on radicalization in Central and Eastern Europe, because we treat it as organizers as a kind of starting point and the basis for the proper design of the new or reorientation of already undertaken actions in the preventing radicalization. In our opinion, without the current knowledge and the proper understanding of the current trends in the prevention of the radicalization threat, it is not possible to plan, to create and implement effective preventive measures. So this is why we invited to our discussion distinguished speakers from many entities, because we would like to create the comprehensive and complete picture of the current situation in this part of Europe mentioned by me. It means Central and Eastern Europe. So this is why we invited for the discussion a representative of European body. It means from European Commission, which is responsible for shaping policies in the area of preventing radicalization. However, we also invited representatives of key networks, gathering policymakers and practitioners, translating European policy language into national practical solutions. This is why we have today on board representative of Radicalisation Awareness Network, as well as European Forum for Urban Security. But today's discussion couldn't be fruitful without a representative of the local environments and the national environments. So this is why we also invited for our discussion very distinguished representative of Institute of Social Safety from Poland, which is a non-governmental organization supporting the adoption of the practical activities undertaken to prevent radicalization to the reality of Central and Eastern Europe. So now I would like to invite for the presentation the first speaker, who is Aleksandra Wesoly from European Commission. So Aleksandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marzena. I'm happy to be here. My name is Aleksandra Wesoly. I work in the prevention team in the European Commission since 2016. And at first, I would like to outline the recent trends in radicalization and terrorism in the EU, seen from the perspective of the European Commission, and inform how the European Commission has been active in this respect. So in recent years, jihadist terrorism and extremism remain the main threat to Europe. We all know where the attacks took place. The threat from violent right-wing extremism was, according to Europol, because I'm basing myself for the statistics on their statistics, was substantial. And we are speaking here about lone actors, and left-wing extremism was a problem, I would say, of the Mediterranean countries like Spain, Italy, Greece. So in accordance, reflecting this threat, considerable and sustained efforts have been made by the EU member states to improve the knowledge and expertise in dealing with jihadist extremism. Countering right-wing violent extremism has also been an important focus of EU initiatives, reflecting the fact that some member states have been confronted with different expressions of this phenomenon. But following the March 2019 attack against the two mosques in Christchurch, then in June 2019 assassination of Walter Lubka, then October 2019 Halle, February 2020 Hanau, it has become clear that the right-wing extremist threat continues to evolve. I know I'm supposed to speak about trends in Central and Eastern Europe today, but from the Commission's perspective, it is somewhat evident that especially activities of violent right-wing extremists transcend borders. It is now sort of a global issue and not limited to cultural and historical pasts of countries, but to rather the ideas and narratives that can be found on the internet that are conspiratory in nature and affect and mobilize global audiences. So as for activities of the European Commission in strategic orientations on coordinating EU approach to prevention of radicalization, this is a flagship document, let's say, adopted yearly by the Steering Board on Radicalization. Right-wing extremism figures as one of the priorities next to jihadi extremism, and that remains a primary focus. So in this context, last year, Sweden, with support of the European Commission, organized a study visit to the city of Berlin, a small city in Sweden, but extremely touched by right-wing extremism. This was done for interest member states to discuss local challenges of right-wing extremism and its wider national and EU implications. And this study visit resulted and highlighted a number of points that we need to consider for the future. So the member states have noticed that we need an overview of effective national tools for law enforcement among member states, so in criminal law, administrative law, and other measures. We need to reassess the use of effectiveness of banning violent extremist organizations. National government support for local governments with developing local multidisciplinary action plans is crucial. And we need more research into reasons why individuals join and exit right-wing violent extremist organizations. So for our part, the European Commission has circulated a questionnaire to EU member states, mapping out how they tackle right-wing extremism, and we are currently preparing an analysis of the EU member states' national legal and policy responses to addressing right-wing extremism, with a view also to make recommendations for common preventive actions. As for online radicalization, the Commission has been engaging with internet companies on a voluntary basis in the EU Internet Forum to respond to the challenge of removing terrorist content online. And following the Christchurch attack that I mentioned, that was streamed on the internet, the members of the EU Internet Forum are working together to establish a blueprint for a crisis protocol to prevent such materials from being widely circulated. Also, within the EU Internet Forum, we organized a dedicated workshop on online violent right-wing extremist propaganda last May. Discussions have shown there that we need more clarity on the concept of right-wing extremism. We need to look at the phenomenon in a comprehensive manner, including hate speech, terrorist propaganda, use of disinformation campaigns, and for extremist purposes, and to strengthen the digital resilience more broadly of our societies. Of course, I have to mention COVID-19. Of course, when it comes to trends, it has and will have a huge impact on radicalization in all its forms. Because what we have observed, and all member states in the steering board for radicalization confirmed this, it is that all extremists were using COVID-19 to their advantage. And they were hampered physically by confinement measures, but extremists were more active online, exploiting the fears and grievances of vulnerable individuals. Also, new forms of violent extremism materialized, arson attacks on 5G antennas. Although this conspiracy theory was already supported by some right-wing and left-wing scenes before COVID-19, it has actually materialized as active violent extremism. We have strange ideological hybrid forms of radicalization, not fitting any defined theory. They appeared created by individuals from collecting bits and pieces from all sorts of narratives online. And what is also a very worrying factor during the COVID crisis as well is that the pandemic gave the extremists the opportunity to influence public debates and connect to populations that normally were beyond their constituencies. I would like to tell you maybe also about how we support practitioners, although I know that Stephen will tell you everything about it afterwards. So from my side, I would like to mention that both jihadist extremism and right-wing extremism have been at the center of the activities of the Radicalisation Awareness Network that the Commission funds. In recent months, almost all RAN working groups prioritize right-wing extremism in their exchanges, next to having a primary focus on jihadist extremism. We are not forgetting this form of extremism. And by organizing seminars and workshops for first-time practitioners and by formulating recommendations afterwards, they contributed to the ongoing work strands in the area of right-wing extremism. We also support civil society actors with developing alternative narratives for the undesirable messages of violent extremism. The Commission set up the Civil Society Empowerment Program under the umbrella of the EU Internet Forum, and projects include, for example, Youth Right On, which aims to enhance resilience and critical thinking among young people, and Eurotopia, and also Do One Brave Thing, who Jacek will tell you maybe about it a bit, where former members of violent extremist organizations, survivors, social workers, and young people deliver online call to action campaigns. I was also asked by the organizers to see whether the current approach to systemic prevention of radicalization is effective or needs to be changed or improved, and I would say yes. Since I'm working in this field, I feel we are constantly improving and need to improve and adapt to disrupt the evolving field. I feel that policymakers, researchers, practitioners need to work closer together as they complement each other. We need to be more agile in our responses. Everything is happening very fast nowadays. We cannot take time to reflect too much, too long, analyze too deeply. We really need to act. But at the same time, we need very strong evidence-based policies and very good research. So in this context, we very much support all the projects that we finance, all the Horizon 2020 projects, ISF projects that fill this knowledge gap. As well, we need to support the local level, because this is where the bulk of the work is actually done. So with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Aleksandra, for this especially for the very useful tips for practitioners, but not only, because this showing those current trends are very, very important for us. Also because of the topic of today's meeting, which is dedicated mostly, and especially second panel of the day is dedicated to the right-wing extremism. So thank you very much for your speech. And now I would like to give the floor to Stephen Lenos, who is the representative of Radicalisation Awareness Network. Stephen, the floor is yours.
See, now I'm unmuted. I think people can ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A, I'm being told, so please feel free. I will share my screen now. It's actually here, I think you can see my screen now. I hope you can see my screen now. Well, first of all, good morning from sunny Amsterdam, from an almost empty, that's not my phone, from an almost empty ranch staff headquarters. I prepared a little presentation. It's actually slightly longer than the 10 minutes that were given to me, so it will be shared with you so you can read the rest of it. Trends and practices in Europe. I'm also touching on practices. I would love to share with you our expertise on the trends in Central and Eastern Europe, but to be honest, actually, we're still looking for the trends, and I think most of us are looking for trends. So I'm very pleased with your effort to try and picture the trends and get some more expertise or knowledge on this topic. A little bit about the RAND first, because there are still, after 8-9 years, people who don't know the RAND. Then I'm going to say what I know about the region. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the thin line or the broad gray zone between legal and illegal, what's extremist and not. And then perhaps there's still time for the practitioners and the practices. First of all, let me see. There's something in the. Did I just kill my PowerPoint? Did I kill my PowerPoint or did I not? Actually, there's something in the right of my screen that's in front of my screen. Is my screen still on?
We can see your screen.
Good. Perfect. I think Aleksandra told already about the RAN supporting practitioners first. This is a practitioners network. It's a community of practitioners. It's from all branches from the police, where Marjane is very active in and will be one of the co-leaders of the RAN police working group, to teachers and youth workers, local governments as well, actually, supporting the EU and member states in their efforts to do their contribution and to disseminate what we learn and what practitioners tell each other about the RAN and the trends to others. The achievements are something you can read later. This is what we're going to do the next couple of months. 61 meetings, and I'm afraid most of them will be, almost all of them will be through this video conference kind of stuff on issues and papers. There are 4 topics which are touched upon more than others. Prisons and rehabilitation. There are some extremists and terrorist offenders who will come out of prison, and we're going to look into their rehabilitation efforts and make sure that when they re-enter society, they're not a risk anymore. We are definitely going to look into right-wing extremism. This is a relatively new topic. It's been around in the RAN from the start, but indeed the focus has been on Islamist extremism, and there will be more on Islamist extremism, but besides that, there will be right-wing extremism and returning children and women, because in Syria and Iraq there are still a lot of women and children influenced to a high level to the Islamist ideology who might return, and we need to prepare. In this year, we reshuffled the RAN working groups a little bit. There's still communications and narratives. I'm telling this because I would like to reach out to practitioners to engage with us and make sure that you know what's going on and that you can feed into it. You can report yourself as being interested in participating. Next year, there will be more activities for researchers and policymakers. So keep in mind, for the RAN, its main focus is on practitioners. Feminist communities and social care, local authorities, mental health, police and law enforcement, prison, rehabilitation, youth and education, and victims of terrorism. Those are the groups that we are building our activities around. This one I will skip to. This is too complicated. I think I hear someone talk in the back, so I think everyone should mute his or her microphone to make sure that there's no disturbance. In general, the key elements of the RAN DNA is it's about involving and training first-line practitioners, which is key. Prevention is key. I think that is important, because if you would focus too much on actual terrorism and actual violent extremist deeds, you might miss the part of the process that's radicalization that might lead up to these horrible things. So don't underestimate the importance of prevention and working in the areas of radicalization. Within the RAN, we learned that we need everyone. No party can do it on its own, and it should be tailor-made, adapted to local circumstances. And that's why this conference is being very interesting, because we need to know what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe. So help us out. To be honest, we don't have the answers also, neither, so help us out, please. So what's going on? This is a little picture which we use very often. I also use when I deliver training in Central and Eastern Europe. I've been delivering training in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, well, a lot of countries in the region. This is what I was stressing, actually. So make sure that we are using the same words, because I'm not a freak for definitions. You could spend all day discussing and defining, which is not, I think, the best way of spending your time. But we do need to make sure that we understand what we're trying to prevent and what we're discussing. And I think it's extremely important to understand the difference between activism and extremism. And that radicalization is the approach that will lead people from being active, angry, concerned, expressing their opinions, fighting for their interests in a peaceful way, and where radicalization is leading them towards extremism and terrorism. And the RAN is in a prevention of violent extremism and terrorism. And I think if you want to prevent dark blue versions, or even which could be red, the terrorism part, you need to work on the threshold between activism and extremism to avoid people entering into extremism. What do we know? Well, actually, I want to, as a sort of inspiration, I would like to introduce the RTV Trends Report. Within the RADPol working group, we had the honor of having Tore Björgo in the meeting. And he presented the works of Jacob Ravendal and the others, and his work as well on the right-wing terrorism and violence, right-wing terrorism violence trend report published by the University of Oslo. And it was extremely wide and interesting. If you Google it, you will find it, RTV Report 2020. And I think one of his great contributions was that for the northwestern part of Europe, he's put in a lot of effort in collecting all kinds of data to make sure you understand the trends. And this is what the perpetrators for right-wing extremism look like in 2019. And you see a large portion, more than a third, was put up by lone actors. And even more important was this picture he shared with us, where you see that the red part, once again being lone actors, over time has become the predominant perpetrator type, where within the northwestern part of Europe, the groups and gangs, which were green on the left, were the most important phase of the enemy we were fighting. Well, I don't like the language actually, but the phenomenon that we would like to prevent. They have become smaller and smaller and smaller actually. So we need to know, if you want to talk trends, I think you need data like this to understand that who are we discussing? What is the modus operandi of the people that we're working on? And also an interesting thing is the change in the target groups, who or what is being targeted by these right-wing terrorists and extremists. And there you see there's a shift. And one of the most important shifts is actually I think it's the black one, which has become relatively bigger. And the black one is state institutions, that's including politicians. And if you have extremists who are targeting police, who are targeting democracy, institutes of democracy and politicians, for instance, they're definitely threatening democracy and fundamentals that base European democracies and Europe as we know it. And that's actually also an interesting kind of data you would like to have. But then again, this is the northwestern part of Europe. So I know that the CREX Center for Research on Extremism would love to expand their data set to other regions as well. And in that sense, is this effort also very interesting that you're doing within this project. But if we want to discuss trends in Europe, I think we need more data. This, especially on right-wing extremism, violent right-wing extremism, there's not enough validated data. And we need more effort of research institutes, of governments, of police to help to make a better picture. Recently published is the TSET report by Europol, which had interesting pictures also from the eastern, southern, central part of Europe. You will all be able to find it. Google TSET 2019 and you'll see the annual report on last year. And there you see indeed there is a number of terrorist attacks and arrests in the central and eastern part of Europe. In orange you see the attacks, and you're lucky, central and eastern part of Europe don't have too many attacks, but there has been arrests. And according to the police data set, 2019, not all countries were victim of attacks or had foiled attacks, but you see some Central and Eastern European countries showing up on this list for different sorts of extremism. And I think right-wing extremism is one of the things that might be relevant for Central and Eastern Europe. Well, you can go through my presentation and read it yourself. This was 1 year before. I thought it would be interesting also to look back not only to 2019 but also 2018. Once again, also countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I think there's also some left-wing stuff going on. Conviction penalty is the same picture, and I think the most important thing you could say by observing these data is that there's a slight difference, and we all know this, between Northwestern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. And I've been within the RAN from the start, or actually slightly before the start. I think my time's up almost. And I know that we've been discussing jihadist extremism for years, and people from Central and Eastern Europe were somehow not at the center of the table always, because the numbers of attacks and the numbers of perpetrators and numbers of people who are radicalizing for Islamist extremism has been low in the region. And now the renewed attention to right-wing extremism, I find right-wing extremism is, I think, offering an opportunity for Central and Eastern European countries to step forward and to take up the lead in discussions and the meetings within the RAN on extremism, because I think right-wing extremism is one of the topics, and I would really love to see a more clear picture of what's going on, because I can just share that when I was delivering training, there's a mixed, blurry picture of what's going on, and that's actually this picture, and then I will end actually. We learned over the years how to describe global Islamist extremism. We knew the words, we knew the organizations, and by organizing a couple of meetings on right-wing extremism, most people start to understand that on the right-wing extremism side of the landscape, which is much more blurry, many more organizations, many more ideologies, and they're all evolving always. There's lone actors in a swarm, there's organizations, there is old school neo-Nazi organizations to very Satanist, modern, alt-right kind of organizations, more authoritarian organizations, and they don't, you shouldn't all throw them into one bottle and say this is all right-wing extremism. And there's even within countries a need to define right-wing extremism and define what is the form of extremism that we don't want. Do we want extremism that's challenging the use of force by police and military? There are countries where there are militia and there are vigilante groups challenging the force that's actually dedicated to police and military. There are countries where fundamental values within the European Union, like the freedom of demonstration, is being challenged by others. And the big problem is, in all countries, there's what we like to say in the picture, there's a thin line between activism and extremism, but in reality, it's a broad gray zone. And we need to get better in understanding what is legal, what's illegal, what's problematic, what is an area for prevention of radicalization, to be more effective in the prevention of right-wing extremism. And I think we're on the beginning of a journey where we need each other. We need to have more of these meetings to better understand the topic and get better at it. Last thing, sooner or later, I think we'll get better at defining and sharing with each other what right-wing extremism in the eastern part of Europe looks like. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of, well, I don't know, is it taboo, is it denial, is it confusion? I don't know, actually. I woke up this morning with the news that there are training camps in Eastern Europe. I've been told this before, where right-wing extremists from our part, the northwestern part, I'm in Amsterdam actually, are going to the eastern part to be trained. Is it ideology? Do they get training in MMA? Or is it even weapons that they're being trained in? We don't know, and there's so much confusion and fog around that we need to get better. I'm just saying, we're going to speak with Jacek later on. You're lucky because over the years we've had many excellent practitioners in different work groups and activities from Central and Eastern Europe who've played a role, and I think they'll prove to be golden in defining the problem and finding ways of tackling right-wing extremism and radicalization in Central and Eastern Europe. I think I'll stop here. People can read the things that I skipped in my presentation. And that's it. I'll end, Marjana. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your very interesting presentation. So now I would like to give the floor to two representatives of European Forum for Urban Security, to Staņislavs and Raimons Nitish. So guys, the floor is yours.
So hello everybody, I hope you hear me loud and clear. So my name is Stan and Raymond is coming right now. So we both are from Riga Municipal Police, but here we are representing EFUS, and we'll speak a little bit more about project practices that happened some years ago and finished this year. So let's go to the presentation. I hope you see it good. It is, yep. So let's press F5 and show it. Okay.
Right.
Yep. But before, a little bit about EFUS. So it was founded in 1987, and now it's gathering about more than 200 European local and municipal authorities. And so this forum, European Forum for Urban Security, is made to help together practitioners and to fight against different problems of European countries and cities, as well as radicalization, violent extremism, and terrorism. So the project practices was launched in 2017. And during this project, we were trying to find out what is the radicalization, and the best part of it, to find out some tools and some decisions how we can deal with these radicalizations, some tools for local municipalities, local authorities. And I won't speak very deep about the results of the project, because you can go to the webpage practices.org and find all toolkits. I will just go like very slightly to show what happened in the end of the project. But you asked us to speak about trends observed, but before we speak about trends, what is radicalization? Here is 4 or 5 quotes from different science papers from sociology, speaking about radicalization and extremism problems. There are a lot more of these scientific papers, but why I'm putting here some of them to show you that there is no one common idea what the radicalization is. And it's really the problem, because in some papers we can find out the thought that radicalization and extremism are linked together. In some, that they are different. In some, that the radicalization is pushing your active position. In some, not. So how we can speak about trends if we not really know what the radicalization is? Steven showed you this slide, and I will show you too. Is the slide or process shown on this slide better? Sorry, Steven, I would say no, because it's also is pointed to something violent. But if the radicalization is not violent, if it's like active position, are we not speaking about it? No, we need to speak. And now I need to be honest, because working in practices project, all practitioners were also fox-like and slicky, because during the project we were talking about violent radicalization and extremism. Why so? Because for us, like practitioners, it's easier to work with violent radicalization and extremism, because we can see it and some kind measure it. Is it terrorist attack? Is it some violent actions? But if we want to speak about all trends happening in Europe, we need to remember that the radicalization couldn't be always very violent. So you can pick any color and find any trend you want. I like this image in the right corner very much, because it has really 2 forms of radicalization. It illustrates 2 forms. One of radicalization, it will be green one, called by Greta. And the second one, it will be radicalization of anti-green people, charged car owners. If you pick another color, we can find, for example, bicycle riders radicalization in cities, when they're gathering in hundreds and thousands bicycle riders moving through the city and making chaos and proposing ideas that they are owners of the city, not anyone other. We can speak about pedestrian radicalization. It sounds stupid, but it is. For example, in Riga, we have a group of so-called radical pedestrians that are hating car owners. If you have car, go live to the village. Car is not for the city. In Riga, we receive each year 50,000 calls from these pedestrian radicals about car parking. Are they all violent? Not now, no. Are they making public disorder? Yes, they are making. So do we need to speak about these types of modern radicalization or not? Yes, because maybe they will become violent. Maybe it will be another forms of radicalization after some years. So it's point to think if we can speak only about violent radicalization trends, don't looking on other happening in the local municipality level. So that's why working in proximity project, when we understood that if we speak about only Islamism, only about terrorism or white radicalization against these groups or against LGBTs, we won't go very far. We started to focus not on the problem of radicalization itself, but on the people and making tools to prevent any form of radicalization. Here is 4 tools that were created during the Practices project. If you go to the Practices.org website, you'll find the more information and methodology of these tools, but it was Citizens Agora, Desistance Pro, Digital Me, and Serious Games. It was groups of tools for practitioners how to involve people of the cities or people of some groups of families to different projects to make them speak, to think critically about things happening in the world. Also, the software program was created for practitioners to find some radical issues working with people. Also, a lot of recommendations for local authorities were made. I won't speak now about all of them. Here is the main topics. And first of all was inclusion and well-being of the population. So the main idea was that there is a lack of civic education now in schools, and educational system isn't adapted to modern world problems, and the local authorities need to focus on it to involve families in as active part of society. Speaking about professional culture and collaboration, this toolkit or problem was found out when we spoke about civil workers, police officers, teachers, and other, and when we understood that we need to have a better training based on shared common knowledge. Practitioners need coaching and supervision, and we need to strengthen collaboration between different actors. Speaking about local democracy and citizen involvement, the success of prevention policy depends on the active participation of civil society, and the communication in both directions, especially towards young public, is needed. When we speak about innovation and technologies, we need to understand that internet, social networks are very effective means of disseminating extremist speeches, radical speeches in all fields of radicalization. And we need to propose alternative discourses that convey positive messages and promote democratic values. If we speak about local and regional authorities and the European Union, we figured out that local authorities often feel disconnected from the whole European institutions. So we need to strengthen this network, this connection between local authority, municipality, European Union, country government, and European Union government to make them come together to speak about the problems and to make for solution. And last not least, local governance and strategies. Short-term actions and projects that link and fit into long-term structures is needed. And if we speak about municipalities, that primary focus on prevention, not on fighting, but on prevention, working with people. If we make people happy, the radicalization will be smaller. So it was our short view on the practices project, and of course we'll answer your questions. Maybe Raymond want to add anything? No? Okay, thanks a lot.
So thank you very much, Staņislavs and Raimond, for your very interesting presentation, and especially for this emphasizing the need of prevention, which was already mentioned by the previous speakers. And now I would like to invite and to give the floor to Jacek Purski from Institute of Social Safety. And before his speech, I would like to emphasize that this voice is very crucial for our today's discussion, because this is the voice from the ground, I would say. This is the voice from Poland, where the problem of right-wing extremism is increasing, and especially that this is the voice from the real experts involved very actively in the prevention of radicalization. So Jacek, the floor is yours.
All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jacek Purski. I represent the Institute of Social Safety from Poland. As we have not much time, I will straightly go to the presentation to show you some key points that I prepared for you. What I would like to emphasize at the very beginning, the Institute of Social Safety is the organization that is focused on prevention and countering radicalization in Poland, but mainly introducing those topics into the public debate and into the wider audience in the country, but also in the region. We base on the educational tools like trainings, workshops, and lectures, and we share the knowledge on the basis of innovation techniques by building cooperation with different actors. It includes police, internal security agency, local authorities, but also I would like to mention here the huge group of teachers which we work regularly. This cooperation is based on two elements. One is the national expert team, which is the group of approximately 20 experts from all around the country who are from very different fields, and they refer to the issues linked with violent extremism and radicalization. These are psychologists, these are social workers, educators, former members of police and army as well. And based on this knowledge, we create local expert groups, which is it's an offer that is targeting municipalities, cities, like for example Dąbrowa Górnicza, very progressive city where we've started action that is part of the Champions project, and it consists of creating the local expert group that we work regularly, and the local authorities from the municipality, they gain the knowledge about the radicalization and violent extremism, and we are very much impressed how they go and which direction they are actually go to with the knowledge provided by the experts of the national expert team. Then it's worth to mention that we're also quite active on the EU projects, including Champions, Do One Brave Thing, and Precobias in the moment. But I will elaborate more about the systemic type of approach and building the national strategy, including national agency as a think tank type of our activity. But to start, what I was asked by the organizers of today's meeting with and the current trends. I think it's very difficult to speak about the current trends without mentioning the radicalization and COVID-19. And when we speak about those issues, we've observed when it comes to current trends, first, the growing wave of the hate crimes related to or targeted to people with Asian origin on the street level. I believe that it's very, very crucial to have a proper monitoring of the street level grassroots activities of the extremists, and this came out as a very first reaction on COVID-19. What appears later on, and it's typical for the current trends, are the fake news and the conspiracy theories. We had this in the debate about the extremism for already a couple of years, quite a long time, when it comes to conspiracy theories with fake news as well. But trends like promoting the conspiracy theory about white genocide or great replacement, this is now a trend that we can see in the whole Europe, and this right-wing orientated narrative that comes back to conspiracy theories is highly promoted by people related to groups like, for example, autonomous nationalists all around the Europe, alt-right when it comes to US, but this also relates to identitarian movement, identitarian movement that will grow. We've observed that identitarian movement was a part of the extremist movement. I think that basing on the narrative linked with COVID-19, that the national countries only can build the proper answer for the crisis situation, and then exploring what does it mean, the identitarity, what is national country, etc., 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 etc. This movement can grow in the future, and we already observe it in the Eastern Europe that this narrative is present. Then what we've observed quite recently, but this is something for researchers interesting to have a closer look at, is the neo-Nazi accelerationism. Very interesting trends that is actually using the crisis situation of COVID-19 to accelerate anti-democratic movements, anti-democratic trends. It can work on the national level or global level, but the most frightening is the local level. When we have local problems linked with with crisis, both social, economical, or simply straight related with the coronavirus pandemic situation, but the accelerationists are the group that are present in the web highly and very actively. And then when it comes to current trends, the individual radicalization, very I would say not very strongly represented in the academic discussion, and usually when we've researched the topic over the last years, the individual type of radicalization, what I mean by this is oriented on individual issue problem. Sooner or later, when we dig deeper, it came out that at the end of the narrative of the radicalization and the individual radicalization, there's right-wing extremism. It happened with a number of different stories that we researched over the years. But when it comes to 5G mobile phones technology, we've observed something very new, because here the individual radicalization is related to different forms of radicalization that we knew from already for years. What I mean by this, there's quite a lot of religion-motivated conservative approach, but there's a lot of right-wing extremism and the environmental left-wing activities as well present there. So I would say very, very interesting individual radicalization model. And just to give you an example, we just heard about the person that from the moment observing the footprint, the Google footprint of the person who first time visit a website about 5G, till the moment that the person fired the technical equipment of the 5G technology was 48 hours. So we have this case, and I think this says a lot about the process of radicalization that we've observed, that from the early moment to the act of vandalism here can be very short. And then if we speak about the changes in the global movement, in the changes of the right-wing extremism or generally radicalization, here we can observe something which relates to the theory of the modern leadership. I just implemented it here because it says a lot about the perspective that we have in the scene now. This is the VUCA model is actually based on the researches about the battlefield in the army, but now it's used in the modern leadership knowledge. The VUCA model relates to the volatility, the uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this type of looking through the VUCA model at the radicalization nowadays in the times of crisis says a lot about the field that we have here. Then, what is also important, and it's worth mentioning, is the mainstreaming extremism. And when it comes to mainstreaming extremism, I mean that the knowledge, the message, that the narrative that we've seen among the right-wing extremists in the previous year, now it's part of the narrative of the mainstream. I would say maybe not the main field of politician, but it's part of the wider political discussion. And it's actually quite understandable. We can observe it watching the narrative proposed by some of the journalists that are now going mainstream, but in the area when they were actually teenagers or around 20, they were part of the extremist groups. Now they are getting mainstream, and this narrative is actually seen in the context of the public discussion. And then the political earlier support, but now I would say a direct inspiration. Politics of the mainstream of the populist parties are using the narrative made by extremists, and that was years ago strictly dedicated only to the group of really of the activists of the right wing, or the extremists that were spreading their, I don't know, hateful, racist, neo-fascist ideology. This inspiration, so the mainstream politicians are inspiring. They are inspired by the narrative that was linked some years ago only with the more extreme groups. Then we see the false symmetry between different forms of radicalization that is present in the debate. New trends are coming from the East. If you're from all around the Europe, just have a look where your extremists are going for the demonstrations, for different type of activities, what kind of examples they share. The trends are coming from the East to the West. This is the direction what I see when it comes to right-wing extremism. Nowadays, online means more effective. This is important. I think that and here I'm referring to what Stephen actually said earlier, to the role of the prevention, because I see that if the extremists are going into the web, if they're going more online on everyday basis, their recruitment is actually much more effective. Their materials are all and on present in the internet. They don't need to have this personal one-on-one contact, and they change the methodology. This is important. When it comes to changing the methodology, old school activism versus modern extremism. An important issue. I believe that there's quite a lot of NGOs, but also policymakers that look at the perspective of radicalization that leads to violent extremism with a very, very old school approach. But the by modern extremists, I mean here people who are changing on and on, changing their methods, changing their effective approach to radicalize person, to mobilize different groups that were not accessible by them earlier, and with the changing world that is going more online, they are more effective with spreading the information. When it comes to challenges, I mean the old, new, and this relates to what is the relations between the Western and Eastern countries situation in Europe. There are very good methods and approaches that are actually existing in a number of countries, and they are actually not existing in Central Eastern Europe on the educational level basis. And I would like to mention just here briefly the media literacy, critical thinking, and dialogue as a competence or nonviolent communication, and important issues that can be part of the recommendation, because when it's come to recommendation, the recognition and understanding, I see we have different understanding nowadays, and the recognition is something for policymakers. The recognition of the problem is actually crucial here. Without it, we won't do the step forward. And in the Eastern Central Europe, the recognition and understanding is the first point. I know it might sound strange for a couple of professionals who are visiting our webinar today, but recognition is it is an aim for the starting point. Then the depoliticalization. Radicalization is getting political. It's part of the political debate. It shouldn't be like this. When it's used by politicians to defend, prove, or to campaign on their political in their political approach-based activities, very dangerous, and we see all the time that it's part of the political game. It shouldn't be like this. It's a very important recommendation for the policymakers and the general public. Education, tailored public education, important, but I don't have to explain much about it here. An expert voice, the international networks, NGOs, important approach in the public debate. Then we have the something which is called the VUCA answer, or VUCA 2.0. It's also part of the Leadership Academy, but I would like to mention it that for the type of understanding the radicalization world with uncertainty, complexity, or ambiguity, there is an answer, which is a vision type of approach, understanding type of approach, clarity, fighting for making more clear clarity approach and strategy, and agility as a solution for the more and more complex and diverse world of radicalization here. And then we come to systemic solutions, which I believe are crucial here. So I mentioned them also in recommendations, because I don't believe, honestly speaking, that the ad hoc campaigning, maybe some educational work which is not tailored, or different type of approaches which are proposed by policymakers or NGOs are the solution. I believe in systemic approaches. I believe in the strategies that are nation-wide, and here the Institute of Social Safety is building actually a systemic innovation which is based on the best EU practices. So this is actually what we came out from the Radicalisation Awareness Network, from the materials that were made by the network for over ages. Not ages, yes, but here we have a huge portion of materials that can be used by first-line practitioners, and based on it we build the strategy, which is focused on coordination, education, prevention, and communication. And it is a national agency, but also a national program that will go local. And here we go both ways. First is a concept that is made by the academics based on research, so it's a research evidence strategy. Then it's linked with the think tank, which is a process based on the national expert team that I mentioned earlier. So this group of experts that we have, and they go multi-agency, they go multi-sectoral for different, from one page to another. So this initiative can be a support for different practitioners, including police, including Ministry of Education, including the first-line practitioners, and then it goes local. So it's a strategy that it also involves a national agency. And of course, the implementation needs a political support, and the political support is probably crucial for the first-line practitioners that we have here in the webinar. But it's important, but it's also part of the strategy. And here I would also like to mention the role of RAN, which I believe that this systemic approach, which is building a system type of multi-sectoral institution, can be also a part of the narrative that RAN is offering to the member states. I believe that RAN is now having the huge set of knowledge, and what would be in my opinion, a crucial step forward would be to transform this knowledge to the national level. And with such national agencies or national systems of answers, of solutions, it can be a huge step forward when it comes to Central Eastern Europe, for sure, where there's a lack of such strategies and lack of such approaches which are based on multi-sectoral, but also are using the existing networks of practitioners. That will be all from me. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm happy to answer all your questions. The Institute of Social Safety is present in different EU programs, but also in the social media. So whenever you'd like to contact us, please free, and we'll be very happy to answer your questions. And yeah, so that would be all. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Jacek, for this extremely inspiring input from your side, from the side of the Institute of Social Safety. And now, in accordance to our agenda, we have just a second. I have to share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Yes. Oh, thank you very much. So now we have a few minutes for questions and answer session. But I'm checking the chat box, and so far I cannot see any questions from the audience. So I will use this time just to very briefly summarize everything what we heard today, because I can say that I have many notes, but I would like to just indicate not even the most important, because everything was extremely important today, but I would like to indicate at least a few improvements, recommendations indicated by all speakers today. And in the meantime, I will be checking the chat box. If there is a question from the audience, of course I will ask those questions to our speakers. So I would like to start from the trends, which were the main topic of our today's discussion. So in those trends, we can see hate crimes, fake news, we can see lone actors, but also we can see conspiracy theories as the feeding ground for radicalization, which were emphasized by all speakers, and especially this 5G and the pandemic situation as the feeding ground for radicalization. But also we heard about individual radicalization, which is very important to be seen by policymakers as well as practitioners. So we heard about the need of proper recognition and the recognition of the gravity of the problem and the aim to come to a common understanding of the right-wing extremism. And we heard about the recognition and understanding, meaning the need of depolitization, systemic solutions, including experts' voices, and providing tailored training to practitioners. We heard today also about the individual-oriented approach, bearing in mind the individual roots of radicalization, and seeing the people as a central part of the prevention of radicalization. So we have to start from people. And moreover, we heard about the need of building the bridges between the policymakers, researchers, and practitioners to complement each other, including also private sector. Moreover, we focus on the local governance and the strategies. It means that we were talking about the bringing closer local, regional, and European authorities, strengthening of local democracy and citizens' involvement, as well as inclusion and well-being of the population. And we can do this through professional culture, collaboration, innovation, and new technologies. And as the last point, I wanted to indicate also evidence-based policies and good research, and which was mentioned by the speaker. And from my side, I would like to add to this evidence-based area also evidence-based approach and the practices in the field of prevention and counteracting of radicalization. So as the last conclusion, once more, prevention is the key, and the complex and tailor-made approach to the programs and to the policies has to be seen as the priority. So I will check once more. Sorry, I changed the slide, but I'm checking the chat box and I cannot see any questions from the audience. So maybe we still have 3 minutes before the virtual coffee break and before the second panel of the day. So maybe somebody from the speakers would like to say something. Or yeah.
Marzena, there are two questions. One is there a right-wing extremist global mainstream we need to reckon and deal with?
So thank you, Virginia. It's not that the question is not visible for me. So maybe somebody from the speakers would like to answer this question. Yeah, so Aleksandra, please take the floor.
Yes, we can indeed, what we see, and this is for sure, that there is a wave of violent incidents worldwide. As I mentioned already, the Christchurch, New Zealand, but we also had Poe in USA, El Paso. We had Bærum, I think, in Norway. Were all part of this wave. So I see indeed that this is a globalized problem that we are dealing with. Yes. And there is indeed international links between right-wing organizations. They support each other, also online. Although, as the speakers also said, this scene is fairly fragmented and not homogeneous. But there is indeed a wave and a global problem. Thank you.
Yes, please, Stephen, take a floor.
Well, actually, I think I like this word blurry. There's different things separate from each other, sometimes supporting each other. I'm also afraid about this Brent Tarrant kind of copycat manifesto, 8chan, 4chan kind of movement, because they result in the attacks that get the newspapers. But looking at my screen and looking at AFUS, I really like AFUS. I think anti-Semitism and xenophobia are actually two main narratives, main ideologies, which on the ground in societies, in smaller and bigger towns all over Europe, create tensions and violence and are being exploited by extremist groups. So it's actually both. It's both the acceleration, great replacement kind of stuff, the identitarian stuff that's being exploited by the copycats of Brent Tarrant and Breivik and all the others. But if you try to understand it from what drives it, what's going on in society, I think xenophobia and anti-Semitism, the hatred of Islam are driving forces, which in the end, in small cities and towns, will make a big difference, and in schools as well, actually. And they don't compete with each other. They're all not always one-on-one the same, but they do influence each other.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for your input. Anybody else would like to add something? Because in the chat, I can see the additional question.
There are other questions if you'd like
yes.
to. Regarding the normalization of extremist narratives, are there currently any strategies or approaches that take into account the effect that this normalization has on radicalization and people's vulnerability and exposure to these narratives? Apart from increasing resilience to these narratives through critical thinking and media literacy, are there any other approaches that could limit the detrimental effect of this normalization?
So,
parenting in schools, actually. Public debate. People need to speak out and express what they're concerned about, and parents should do so, and teachers should do so. It's also a responsibility of individuals in society. There's no such thing as society. It's only a collection of individuals. And it is difficult to interfere with politics, actually, because, well, it's very hard. This is where the thin line becomes blurry. It's very difficult to distinguish concerns from anger, from hate speech. They blur into each other every now and then. Well, hate speech might be different, but it's confusing. I think it needs society. It needs individuals. There will not be a separate law against politicians. I think that the existing law should be enough.
So thank you, Stephen, for your comments. Anybody else would like to add something to the topic, to the questions? Yes, please, Staņislavs.
I have a proactive question to Stephen and maybe to other speakers as well. How do you think, is the Black Lives Matter movement radical movement or not? Thank you.
I think it's a radical movement in the way that Italians and the Greek use the word radical, like passionate and fighting for something that they really care about. So this is the radical thing. I think there are definitely elements radicalizing. Radicalizing meaning they become so frustrated or opportunistic that they look for solutions which I would define extremist. So if you're intimidating people, if you're scaring people, even if you use violence, force by removing statues without proper democratic societal solutions, I think you could say there are definitely signs of radicalization in the Black Lives Matter movements. You can't intimidate people, you can't threaten people, you can't pull over statues because you don't agree with it. If we allow people to do this, then other groups will also throw down statues they don't like. So I'm definitely concerned about, we all need to uphold a certain set of rules. And this is also interesting for Eastern Europe. And what are those rules? It would be peaceful solutions. It would be democracy, rule of law, those kind of things. And there are definitely elements within the Black Lives Matter movement who are not abiding to these elements, fundamental values. Even if there's a good cause for action and their movement.
I totally agree with you, but some newspapers would say you are racist. It's a modern trend, you know.
I come from a country where we used to have the celebration of Black Pete in December, and more and more people are trying to get rid of this racist elements in society. There might be racist parts in me because I'm raised in a country which has a colonial background, and there's white privilege, definitely. I'm not sure I would agree with me being a racist, but society might have some elements. I'll be silent for Jacek.
Can I share my thoughts now? Is it are we okay with time?
Yeah, so I just checked the time, so we have 5 minutes more, but I would like to just add something to the audience because we have unexpected problems with the chat box. So there is the possibility, because as we can see, that probably the audience have more questions to the speakers. So there is the possibility to send the questions to the RADPol office, and of course we will contact speakers and we will try to provide the answers to all participants. And now, Jacek, the floor is yours as the last comment. Thank you very much.
I think that the issue with Black Lives Matter is much more complex, and it refers actually to the answers that were provided by the experts in the previous presentations today. So first of all, behind Black Lives Matter, these are people. And people are different, and the Black Lives Matter, some of them are pointing very important issues that are a system type of failures when it comes to minority rights. And I believe that this voice must be heard, and it points very important issues that are part of the activists, or how it was explained in the Stevens presentation, the debate, the opinion type of our status quo, or the everyday life of different communities and society in general. So by saying this, the debate, but also activism is pushing our democracy forward. And I believe that there is a lot of tendencies in Black Lives Matter that is pushing our democracies forward and making it more real. But of course, like it was mentioned earlier, these are also people. So the people behind Black Lives Matter, some individuals are using extremists and radical methods to work. And this is exactly what we mean by tailor-made approach. So when we target the issues linked with Black Lives Matter, we have to look who's there violent, what type of narratives are present there that are actually referring to violent or radical methods in work, not to put everyone in one basket. And I think that this type of and lack of this approach is actually seen in the comments, like you mentioned in the press. It's either black or white. It's not black or white. These are important issues that some of the activists, or even way deep than activists, or radicalized or even extremists individuals are misunderstanding and using methods which are not accepted in a democratic society. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jacek. So let's treat, all comments as just like a trigger points for the further discussions on the issue of the right-wing extremism, but not only. generally speaking, about the radicalization leading, all forms of radicalization leading to violent extremism. So unfortunately, I have to close this panel because we are stealing a bit, the virtual coffee break from the participants. And so finishing this panel, I would like to thank to all speakers and also to participants who are interested in our discussion. And I would like to invite the participants as well as the speaker, of course, for the second panel of the day, which will be dedicated to the right-wing extremism in Central and Eastern Europe. It will be related to the context, challenges, latest research results, as well as the best practices in the field. So thank you very much for your attention and see you in the future.
Good morning to all who are still present. My name is Richard McNeil-Wilson, and I will be chairing the second webinar that we have, second panel that we have as part of this webinar, focusing on right-wing extremism. I'm just going to go over a few kind of housekeeping rules as well. We've heard them with the last panel, but just to make sure that this is fine with everyone and anyone new who has joined. And then I will introduce the panel a little bit more, as well as some of the fine speakers that we have as part of the panel. Just to let you know, the panel will last just over an hour, with each discussant speaking for 10 minutes. Followed by about 20 minutes of discussion. So we will be looking to finish around 12:35 Central European Summertime. Handouts are available for each of the presentations and can be uploaded from the panel section. You're welcome to send in questions at any time. And as we've seen from the last panel, we'd strongly encourage you to send these in at the earliest opportunity and not to wait for the Q&A session to start, due to the possibility of a large number of questions. And it may also be the case that speakers can only answer part of the questions sent in. Following the webinar, there will be a short feedback survey, which I'll also be flagging at the end, with 4 short questions that we'll be reminding you to take. It only takes a minute to complete, so please do this. And finally, please be aware that the webinar is being recorded and will be available along with the presentations on the RADPol2020 website. So I just want to introduce the panel and introduce the speakers as well. My name is Richard McNeil-Wilson. I'm a research associate at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Fiesole in Florence, and the main researcher for the European Commission project Building Resilience Against Violent Extremism and Polarization, or the BRAVE project. The BRAVE project is led by Professor Anna Triandafilidou and works to examine violent extremism and polarization, conducting research into current trends and causes, as well as the growth and impact of CVE programs in Europe. To introduce this panel a little bit, we felt it important to have a discussion on far-right trends within Central and Eastern European, due to concerns over a resurgent far-right in the regions. In a regional context which still grapples with some of the historical legacies of fascism, recent events have seen a surge in far-right populism in countries such as Hungary and Poland, and a rise of a small but vocal parliamentary minority in Germany, as well as significant irregular movements with links both to the east and to the west. Following shooting sprees in Hanau and the killing of a CDU politician in 2019, Germany has responded to the threat posed by violent neo-Nazi groups, prescribing 3 in 2020 alone. Legislation in various Eastern European states has looked to tackle far-right militia, but it is no understatement to say that far-right groups are able to gain substantial legitimacy and organizational footholds in parts of the region. As such, more work is needed to be done looking at the rise of far-right groups and responding to the threat at local, regional, and European levels. Finally, whilst there are suggestions that the spread of COVID-19 may have dampened elements of the far right for now, new coalitions formed in response to COVID restrictions, as well as the risk of patterns of inequality as seen elsewhere, may exacerbate the far right in future. Discussing some of these trends today, we have 4 panelists, and I will give them a brief introduction. Firstly, we have Michael Zeller, a PhD researcher at the Central European University, and a colleague and associate researcher for the Brave Project, specializing in counter-mobilization against far-right demonstrations. Second speaking, we will have Professor Lenka Bushnikova, an associate professor at the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, who focuses on party politics, voting behavior, clientelism, and state capacity, with special reference to Eastern Europe, and is the author of Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, published with Cambridge University Press. Thirdly, we will have Dr. Evian Leidig, postdoctoral fellow at MF Norwegian School of Theology, and an affiliate for the Center for Research on Extremism, otherwise known as CREX, at the University of Oslo, whose current research compares the role of women in the far right in India and the West, and she will be offering some contextual discussions on the far right in Central and Eastern Europe within a global context. And finally, Rosica Jacek, director of the security program at the Center of the Study of Democracy in Bulgaria, whose areas of expertise include radicalization and counterterrorism, organized crime, corruption, and migration. So I will hand over firstly to Michael, who will introduce us to the discussions.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes, all good. Thank you, Michael.
Yes, okay. All right. So today I'm going to briefly talk about far-right demonstrations as a tactic and strategy, specifically in Central and Eastern Europe, and explain why it's important to the far right and some potential responses from state and non-state actors. And we can see even now during times of COVID, when there are all sorts of restrictions on public space activity, when the opportunity is probably more ripe for online activism, as some on the first panel mentioned, there's still an emphasis on demonstrations, on getting out on the street. And part of the reason that is because demonstrations are a long-standing tactic for far-right movements and parties. It matters to new or contemporary far-right movements because it mattered to old ones. So you have these interwar and pre-war fascist and far-right groups with their large martial pomp demonstrations, and contemporary far-right movements play into a bit of nostalgia quite often with their demonstrations. Broadly, demonstrations for the far right serve 2 purposes. On the one hand, they're instrumental purposes, things that help the far right function and that they believe helps them pursue their goals. Internally, this consists of keeping their existing members engaged and doing the work of bonding and connecting those members. Demonstrations can provide what Fabian Verheul calls an emotional collective for the far right. Externally, it can also help to recruit new members, to help network between existing groups, and perhaps most fundamentally, to claim a space in the public sphere, which for so long after the Second World War was denied to many far-right groups. And this gets into the symbolic purposes of demonstrations for the far right. And that's the second grouping of rationales for demonstrations. They are a show of force. They're a demonstration of the far right's capacity to mobilize, and so they can take on quite a menacing air And also there's the nostalgia element that I mentioned. And there's an element of tactical lock-in, of familiarity with the tactic of demonstrations, and also with an ideological commitment to that tactic. If we look at the example of Germany, which has some of the better infrastructure built up to monitor and report and deal with far-right organizations, we can see that there's a pretty steady rate of demonstrations among far-right groups, obviously with the spike for the refugee crisis in 2015-16. And these demonstrations are composed of many annual events, regular meetings that stand out like mile markers on a far-right activist calendar. And this mobilization has persisted despite, Germany's so-called militant democracy, with its many instruments to deal with far-right demonstrations and far-right organizations, as Richard mentioned with the bans this year, for instance. But because all of those instruments are in place and the political context can sometimes be quite hostile in Germany, there's an openness in Eastern European countries for far-right activists, for a little far-right activist tourism, if you like. Eastern states generally have banning powers, if they exist in countries, are rarely, if ever, used. And so several large demonstrations in the model of commemorations of far-right leaders during the war, or for earlier far-right leaders. You have examples like the Day of Honor March in Hungary, the Lukov March in Bulgaria. And these are opportunities for far-right activists to demonstrate in a more favorable environment, less exposed to state counteraction and to counter-mobilization from non-state actors. Within this context, confronted with far-right demonstrations, there's the possibility of outright state sponsorship, which you can witness, for example, in the Bleiburg commemorations in southern Austria, which is sponsored by the Croatian state and has a lot of connections to the Ustasha regime. There are more sort of tacit encouragement or allowance that you see in countries like Hungary that allows and in some instances, at least rhetorically, encourages their far-right event in February. Most generally, there is a sort of muted preserve everybody's right to exercise their free speech rights. So it's a sort of liberal neutralism. On the other end of state responses, there are various measures to restrict far-right demonstrations events, banning certain speakers, and we can think of most prominently perhaps the attempts of David Irving, the Holocaust denier, to speak at several demonstration events, denying access to certain areas where far-right groups may go into minority ethnic communities. There's also the example of earlier this year, February, when Germany prevented several far-right activists from traveling to Bulgaria for the Lukov March. And at the most extreme end, there are banning practices, bringing the state's coercive force to bear to prevent far-right demonstrations from going forward. But with any of these counteractions against far-right demonstrations, it's rare, even in Germany, that this happens unprompted by non-state actors. So non-state responses become quite important. At the most basic level, there's monitoring and reporting of hate crime offenses. And there are plenty of centers that do this. There's the Never Again Association in Poland, the Center for Mass Atrocities Prevention in Budapest. But to be effective, these monitoring sort of initiatives have to be paired with a lobbying arm of activity. So for example, in Germany, the left party, Die Linke, is closely connected with a lot of these monitoring initiatives and make sure to consistently press the federal government about what they're doing in response to deal with the threat of the far right in the public sphere. Beyond monitoring, there are civil and non-confrontational forms of counter-mobilization, and this can take the form of simultaneous direct action like demonstrations, picketing, and leafleting, but also institutional action, bringing court cases against far-right demonstration organizations, pushing for new laws, or lobbying the state to do something. At the most extreme, there is militant counter-mobilization. This is the attempts to shut down far-right demonstrations, either by direct physical confrontation or blockading access to march routes or to demonstration sites. This is most notably associated with anti-fascist and autonomous groups. So taking these all together, there are a few important takeaways that I want to stress. The first is that demonstrations are not going to go away. Even as far-right movements become more concentrated on digital activism, digital mobilization, demonstrations remain an important tool that far-right groups keep going back to. Context, and we can see some signs that activists from Western and Central Europe prefer to go to Eastern Europe to take part in their activism, and this was mentioned a bit in the first panel. The state does have the tools to deal with the far right, but often, even in countries like Germany, it needs prompting to take the threat of far right seriously and to do something about it. Even with Richard mentioning these 3 bans on far right groups in Germany, that only happened after quite a bit of lobbying, as well as some really notable, well-publicized attacks by far right perpetrators. So in view of that fact, non-state action is essential to confronting the far right. And the final takeaway is that there are many patterns, many pathways to demobilizing far right campaigns, and there's no one silver bullet solution. It requires a lot of concerted and continual action by non-state and state actors to deal with it. And with that, I'd pass it back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's fantastic. I'm next going to move on to Evian. No, sorry, I'm not. I'm next going to move on to Lenka, who will discuss some more on patterns within Eastern and Central Europe.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. I was listening to the first panel, and I've learned a lot, and I'm really happy to be a part of these, very important debates. Today, I will talk about the paradox of minority accommodation and the way I think it can be linked to radical right mobilization. And I will mostly build on my book that just came out, which is called Extreme Reactions. In that book, I mostly look at vote shares or, voting for radical right or far right parties. But I think some of these insights might apply to general radical right mobilization. And in 10 minutes, I would like to touch upon 3 or 4 issues. Number one, I would like to talk about volatility and how that relates to how the dynamics of minority accommodation can explain a radical right mobilization. In my view, the way I view radical right mobilization, it's a dynamic process. It comes in surges and then it recedes. There are spikes and then the mobilization can go down. So if you want to understand something that's very volatile, you have to have a theory that's also volatile. And in the book, I basically talk about the ways I think xenophobia or racism is not a good explanation for radical right mobilization. It is rather an opposition to the expansion of minority rights, and I'll talk more about it in a minute. Then I will briefly touch upon, I think, one important issue to consider when we look at Eastern Europe, which is the case that in Eastern Europe, the democratization or the introduction of democracy was a parallel process to minority accommodation. And, you know, to an unpleasant surprise of many, when Eastern Europe was offered, you know, very much prized membership in the European Union, they had to, the deal was that they will take on liberal democracy, not electoral democracy, not ethnic democracy, and that minority accommodation or rights will be guaranteed by the states. And one aspect I want to highlight as well is that I think from a broader historical and cross-national perspective, we have to realize that this is a very, very fast-paced process. Third, I would like to touch upon things that were mentioned already in the first panel, and I think we will be coming back to it again and again. I think what we are observing now, if we sort of think a 30-year view, is a big shift from ethnicity to sexuality. So I think that a lot of the components of nationalism or mobilization against ethnicity are dying out in some cases, or they're not as salient. And actually, most of my work has always been about ethnicity, but social conservative values, religiously conservative values, opposition to LGBT rights, you know, same-sex marriage is really becoming you know, a very forceful vehicle for radical right mobilization. So there is a shift that we are observing. Finally, I would like to talk a bit about mainstream parties, or radicalization of mainstream parties, and how it relates to democratic decay. And of course, every seminar these days have to have something to say about COVID-19. And I know that Aleksandra, Wesoly, and Jacek Purski were already, you know, offering some really cool insights in the first panel. So volatility and minority accommodation. So in a nutshell, my book is thinking about, you know, what is it that motivates voters for right parties? And the answer I came up with is that it's not xenophobia, but it's a resentment against aspiring groups. So the radical right is sort of annoyed with politicized new groups demanding rights. The stand is granting them rights, and hence you know, mobilization follows. So the rights I'm talking about, especially when you deal with ethnicity, our language rights, minority education, challenges to dominant narratives about what the hell happened during the World War II, you know, state policies that in the United States we would call affirmative action, you know, promotion of minority candidates on party lists, and so on and so forth. So all these things generate backlash, and I think that the radical right, you know, responds to these changes in the status quo. It responds to the changes in an ethnic hierarchy, or a, you know, hierarchy of a dominant group vis-a-vis a minority group, which sometimes does not have to be based on ethnicity. So all this expansion created a backlash, and the job that, you know, or the outcome that the radical right parties would like to see is to really curb the minorities from advancing. And in this, and I will come back to this point, I'm talking about minorities that are politicized, because one thing that I think, if you take volatility and the volatility of mobilization seriously, also realize that, you know, groups come in and out, that there's a lot of leeway about the groups that are being targeted, and there is a lot of innovation actually in that respect. Briefly about sequencing, the two pictures here demonstrate the shift from ethnicity to sexual rights. This is from a billboard from a Hungarian party that was fighting about restriction of language rights, and the second is a protest in Romania against LGBT rights. So democracy and minority accommodation was introduced in Eastern Europe very quickly and at the same time. So it means that if you really don't like the liberal component of democracy, a lot of people in Eastern Europe will associate it with the introduction of democracy as well, which has very complicated consequences for support for democracy. When you think about the fight for women to vote, or the civil rights movement in the United States, all this expansion, right, from a historical perspective, takes a lot of time, you know, and actually sometimes you think you won, then you go down the rabbit hole again. But in Eastern Europe, this happened really very fast. Within less than a generation, you suddenly have groups asking to you know, adopt gay couples adopting adopting children, or asking for same-sex marriage, or God forbid, you know, Roma minority is applying for grants to support their local government. So this is a very quick change, in a way, if you want to have a sympathetic view, it really asks a lot of certain components of the society to get on board. And sort of, you know, one more time, I think that there were in a way two waves of mobilization. First was ethnicity. Now we are moving towards, you know, fight over social conservative values and sexuality. So in the book I call it From Group to Grid, but this is really a new frontier. I just published an article with Petra Wesoly when we look at LGBT counter-mobilization in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And you see, we don't talk about it a lot, but one of the most fascinating things that we discovered is that Eastern Europe is really the new frontier of the social conservative movement. So you have you know, religiously conservative groups in the United States or in Russia that are really fighting very effectively for this space, supporting groups that you know, push for referenda to ban same-sex marriage and so on and so forth. Another issue that's really interesting is that you see that new groups are being politicized. So this is the refugees. I always say that you know, this is a mobilization against Muslims, but one thing you have to keep in mind, there was a massive wave of Muslim refugees in the 1990s from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the former Yugoslavia. There was never any anti-Muslim mobilization in Eastern Europe at that time. So again, you have to think about the things in context. There are fascinating new configurations around Israel, anti-Semitism, who is for, who is against. One thing I also want to mention, because before I go to the next slide, is that a lot of empirical material for the book was collected in Slovakia, and there you see a really interesting trend in which initially a lot of the mobilization was against the Hungarian minority. There's a lot of pushback, and there was a lot of back and forth. Eventually, today, this might change, there is a status quo that's actually acceptable, and a lot of the radical right mobilization really abandoned the Hungarian issue, and you see a huge shift to religious values and sexuality. So the good thing is that the problem somehow got resolved. There was an accommodation that seemed to be durable, at least for now, but there is a shift to new issues. Now, of course, and this was already mentioned in the previous presentation, one big issue in Eastern Europe is the state response and the mainstream parties reacting to and adopting or stealing or very instrumentally using hate agenda or radical right issues for political purposes. Again, one thing I want to mention, there's a lot to unpack, but there are two things. One thing that's really important, which is to think about sort of the general literature about democratic decay or death of democracy. A lot of that literature assumes that you have a fringe group, crazy niche extremist group that comes in and takes over, and that's where danger is coming from. In Eastern Europe, when you think about Smer, which was the former ruling party in Slovakia, Law and Justice Party, Orban's party in Hungary, all these three parties started out as mainstream parties, and only over time they adopted populist messages, and they adopted some of the radical right rhetoric. So in terms of who poses a threat to democracies or to liberal democracies in Eastern Europe, we really have to look at the mainstream, and the extreme is in a way a cherry on the top. Now, COVID-19, I think COVID is going to be very important. We will see future radicalization. I think we don't know the outcome yet. I think what's going to happen is that each country will it will accelerate trends that already exist in a given country. So it's not going to be a reaction one fit for all. One way is going to be via anti-global movements without the Jewish conspiracy, where people react to massive economic contraction. Another way to go would be identity-based politics. We don't know, but I'm just working on a paper, again, it's on Czech and Slovakia, where it's obvious that the emergency measures that were given to ruling parties were, don't let a crisis to the waste, and I expect really the democratic decay after COVID-19, because these emergency measures were really used ruthlessly to expand their grip on power. Policy implications. Finally, I think there's bad news and good news. So I think the bad news is policymakers should understand that if you push through agendas that expand minority rights, there is going to be a backlash. So there is a price for if you change the status quo, if you shift things, there is going to be a reaction and there is going to be a backlash. So that's the bad news. The good news is that maybe in the short run, this contestation and this back and forth can result in some reasonable equilibrium, where some of these issues can be settled, maybe over a long period of time or a short period of time. So it's doable. It just takes time, a lot of effort, and a lot of patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stanka. That was fantastic. I'm now going to pass the baton over to Evian, who will put some of these discussions into a wider global context.
Fantastic, and you can see my screen? Right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research, and especially to Richard for the invitation. So I'm not an expert on Central and Eastern Europe, but I do study global trends of the far right, so I will be doing so with reference to Central and Eastern Europe in my presentation. So I want to start off my presentation by highlighting an event that took place last October. So last October, a group of 23 members of the European Parliament undertook a quote unofficial visit to India to visit Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as well as the region of Jammu and Kashmir, which had most recently been put under lockdown from the Indian government. And the reason that this trip was so controversial was because journalists and even Indian members of parliament were denied access to the region since it was put under lockdown in August. Now, the trip had been organized by a group of Indian lobbyists based in Brussels. Now, the purpose of the trip, according to these members of the European Parliament, was to, quote, gather information on the region in Kashmir. And it was unofficial in the sense that clearance was given to tour Kashmir, and these MEPs had met with senior government officials and the military. And what you see there is a quote from a member of the European Parliament on the purpose of their visit. And I think what this quote reveals is the rhetoric of a global alliance to fight against Islamic terrorism, which is being employed by far-right actors to legitimize a shared purpose. So much in the same way that the far-right in India sees Islamist extremism as an existential threat to the nation, European far-right figures see Islamist attacks as foreign threats, even when the perpetrators are fellow citizens, such as the Westminster Bridge attacks in London in 2017, as well as the Manchester Arena bombing in the UK. Now, after this visit, it was seen to be flouting diplomatic norms, but there wasn't actually much of a substantial outcome out of this visit. That was until a few months later when members of the European Parliament most who had gone on the trip that were part of this identity and democracy bloc called for a bill to be withdrawn from the European Parliament, which condemns India's actions in the passage of the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act. And just very briefly, the CAA is a bill which allows for the fast-track citizenship of what the Indian government deems to be religiously persecuted minorities in Pakistan and Bangladesh, except that Islam is exempted as a religiously persecuted minority category. So these members of the European Parliament called for the bill to be withdrawn, which criticizes India's actions with the passage of the CAA, essentially citing it as, quote, an internal matter to India. So both the visit of these MEPs, as well as their actions in the European Parliament a few months later, responds largely to how far-right alliances at the international level are being legitimized through state diplomatic efforts by elected representatives. Of course, we also see these relationships being formed at the bilateral level as well. What you see here of these photos of 4 world leaders are how these heads of state share similar stances on Islam and immigration, in effect vocalizing narratives of the extreme right from their respective countries. And I argue that this commonality between them provides a glue at the transnational level. So as you see there in the photo in the top left between Orban and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, during their meeting, Netanyahu had specifically said, quote, the threat of radical Islam is a real one, both for Europe and for Israel, and that Orban is a, quote, true friend of Israel, despite criticisms of anti-Semitism from Orban's administration. And there in the top right, there's a photo of Netanyahu with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And during their meeting, Netanyahu had said, quote, our way of life is being challenged by radical Islam, both to Israel and to India. And similarly, in that photo there in the bottom left of Modi and US President Donald Trump, Trump had said at that meeting, quote, the United States and India are firmly united to defend our citizens from the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. And then lastly, in the bottom right, we see Trump and Orban together, both with shared stances of fighting, quote, illegal immigration, and in reinforcing national border security of their respective nations. Of course, extreme right narratives concerning Islam and immigration does not even need to be articulated by radical right politicians, but can enter mainstream discourse. What we see here is a photo of a meeting between pro-democracy advocate and leader Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar meeting with Viktor Orban last year. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi is not necessarily a far-right politician, but she does represent the popularity of Buddhist nationalism, which is a far-right movement in Myanmar, in her country, an ideology which has motivated persecution of the Muslim Rohingya ethnic minority, which has been described by the UN as a genocide. And in meeting with Orban, the two described concerns with, quote, continuously growing Muslim populations in Europe and in Southeast Asia. Indeed, Aung San Suu Kyi has stood silent on the Rohingya genocide, while Orban has described Muslim migrants during the refugee crisis as, quote, Muslim invaders. I think this is an important point building off of Lenka's previous presentation, which is that, of course, in the 1990s, we did see Muslim refugees, which was not capitalized or weaponized by the far right. But in this instance, I think we need to consider the racialization of these Muslim refugees since 2015. And it's not just at the state level in which we see these alliances being formed, but also the prominent role of intellectuals and ideologues. So this photo that you see here on the left, it's from a Swedish newspaper. It says, Swedish right-wing extremists help Indian nationalists. And that photo of the man next to Modi is Daniel Friedberg, who is a Swedish white nationalist. He co-founded a publishing company called Arctos Media in India in 2009, before moving to Sweden in 2014 and then Budapest in 2015, and operates out of Budapest today. And Freyberg was attracted to Hungary given the changing political climate at the time, which he saw as favorable for the expansion of the Arctus Media Company. And indeed, Arctus remains a popular publishing house today for extreme right books, and Freyberg sees its role as the metapolitics of the far right, or the intellectualizing of extreme right ideas. Similar, as you see there with the photo on the right, other figures like the American Steve Bannon, who has played a similar role in what I describe as political entrepreneurs of the far right. So Bannon, the founder of the media outlet Breitbart News, has long admired politicians like Modi and Orban. Indeed, he has called both of them a Trump before Trump. And Bannon's mission has been to create what he calls the infrastructure globally for the global populist movement. And this was best reflected during the 2019 European Parliament elections, when Bannon tried to create an organization called The Movement, but it did receive mixed backing from various far-right political parties due to various strategic decisions. So just in terms of final reflections, the first is that although the far-right is often viewed at a national or regional level, it is increasingly transnational due to this mainstreaming effect. This occurs because of the mainstreaming of ideas from the extreme right fringe to radical right parties, or hearing from Lenka's presentation, the radicalization of mainstream parties should also be taken into effect, so this feedback loop. And although other forms of far-right organizations like social movements and protest groups do have transnational elements, they tend to focus on local issues for mobilization. What I didn't discuss today, but similarly important, is how online spaces also play a significant role as transnational hubs. But here I focused on state relations and intellectuals, who I see as the most visible manifestations of the global far-right. The second reflection is that the global far-right is characterized by a trend of weaponizing Islamophobia against minorities, whether that be Muslim refugees in Europe, or the Muslim population in India, or as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Rohingya in Myanmar. And often Islamophobia is masked under the rhetoric of, quote, radical Islam or Islamist terrorism, which results in stigmatizing all Muslims as extremists. And this has important consequences when it comes to issues of integration and belonging. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ariane. Finally, we move on to Rosita, who will look at some of the policy responses to right-wing extremism, particularly looking at responses framed around needs.
Is my screen visible now? Yes, okay. Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to present to you a few highlights, insights from Bulgaria, from a recent project, from an ongoing project we're involved in since last year. I know it's always awful to be last, but please bear with me a few more minutes. I'm the director of security program of CSD, and we have been for the past several years involved in research on various aspects of radicalization in Bulgaria and the region. But we decided to start this project. It's called Youth Right On, Resilient Youth Against Far-Right Messages Online, because we saw a real gap in terms of research, policy responses, and even grassroots or civil society actions related to far-right narratives and youth in particular. So while in the past several years, the focus of policymakers in Bulgaria has been a lot on Islamist radicalization, as elsewhere in Europe, the problem of the far right has been not only underestimated and underplayed, even more than that, as you know, from other countries from Central and Eastern Europe. basically with the political, very polarized political and public debate, it has become more difficult to implement any initiatives in this field. So the goals, the objectives of this project, it's a project funded by DG Home, by the Civil Society Empowerment Program. So we wanted to understand to what extent far-right extremist narratives online are appealing to youth, and we define our target group 14 to 19-year-olds, because we know from previous research we've done that most hate crimes in Bulgaria are perpetrated by young people, 18 to 23 years old. But if we want to do prevention, we have to start much earlier. So we wanted to understand, because there was a lack of research in this area, we basically knew very little about this issue. Also to understand push and pull factors, but then also delineate youth groups particularly vulnerable to such narratives and influences online, so we can in the next step develop alternative narratives, an online campaign, but also supporting offline activities in schools. So these are the milestones of the project. We are halfway through, but I'm going to talk about the first part mostly because I think it's more interesting for you to share our data. So we engaged in a quite extensive diagnostic phase because we were lacking the evidence. And in order to target our campaign to the right people with the right messages, we needed to do that. So we first went online on Facebook. We already had some previous knowledge of the ideologies of the main far-right actors in Bulgaria, that they propagate their narratives, but we wanted to see how they are pushed through the online space, how they're framed, through which channels, who, and so on. Once we did that, however, we didn't know anything about how young people respond to that. Are these narratives reaching young people? How appealing do they find them? So the biggest bulk of our diagnostics was this representative survey we did last year. It was a face-to-face survey with our target group, 14 to 19 years old, with over 1,000 respondents, which gave us very rich data. And after we did that, we went into focus groups with students and teachers just to get a bit more detailed, qualitative information of the motivations behind some attitudes or beliefs of young people, and also to test different approaches to communicate to them alternative narratives. I'm going to mostly present to you data about the survey we did, because it was a really big effort, and I think it gives us very valuable information, not only for our campaign, but also for future analysis and for policy making. So basically, this is the rough design. We wanted to see of the survey. We wanted to test to what extent is there approval of certain far-right narratives among young people, to what extent there is approval of violent actions in particular, coming from the far-right spectrum, and then going a step further to test certain behavioral inclinations of young people. So when they're confronted with specific content, far-right content in the online space, how they engage with it, do they react, do they approve it, do they share it, so what's happening? And then at top, what we call far-right activism readiness, both online and offline, to see if they're put in a certain situation where they can join or not certain activities of far-right groups, initiatives, movements, how they would act in a hypothetical scenario. And then we tested a few cross-cutting, of course, variables such as demographics, social, political, psychological factors, the level of civic engagement of young people, because we think this is an important factor if we want to approach them through an online campaign, their online behavior patterns, preferences. We wanted to see what kind of people they're following online, because an online campaign engages a lot of different types of influencers, and then exposure to more generally to violence. So I'll just very briefly present to you. This is a study that we're going to publish in the next few weeks. It's not published yet, but just a few of the highlights that I think are important to mention in this forum. So first of all, in terms of approval of different far-right narratives, and you might ask yourself, what do we mean by that? And I just here presented a few. We formulated more than 15 statements, which we find commonly being pushed by different far-right actors, disseminated in the online space, in media, and so on. So we kind of formulated them across all kinds of topics and ideas that are often used in the narratives of far-right actors. So we see a very widespread approval of anti-Roma messages. Just some examples: 74% of young people surveyed by us agree with statements such as that, not just anti-Roma sentiments, but the statements are formulated in a way that they either demonize certain minorities or portray them as a threat, and also call for violent actions against them. So very clear trend. Anti-Roma statements are approved to a large extent. This also reflects the general situation in the country among the adult population. So this was no surprise for us, actually. We see also anti-migrant sentiments being approved by more than 60%, and then to a lesser extent, anti-Islam, anti-systemic, anti-EU narratives. This is, of course, useful, not very surprising maybe, but when we went into the focus groups with students in schools across the country, which included also people from our vulnerable group, we saw that when young people are confronted with these issues and when they're given the space to talk about it, to reflect, they are very open to alternatives. So this is not a deeply internalized, I'm speaking about the majority of young people, not a very deeply internalized stance. So they actually told us, we have never been asked about this, or we never thought about it, or we never were asked about our opinion. So when you give them the space and a chance to reflect and to think, they're open to, so the picture changes and they're open to more alternative views. We also tested approval of political violence and hate crime. And here we have a few different actions that are more general, like more general political violence, like use of violence to achieve social change, which is a very general statement, but then also very specific actions which we have seen in the past and continue to see in Bulgaria, such as destroying, vandalizing of mosques and so on. So we see that the biggest share, the biggest approval is for the so-called vigilantism. And this, although we have a very strong anti-Roma sentiments, there is, in terms of specific actions, we have a high percentage, over 25% of young people saying, I approve of this type of activities, violent pushback of refugees or arrests of refugees, which we have seen across Central and Eastern Europe a lot. We then tested also acceptance of hateful or violent online content, because it was important to see how young people react to such content when they see it online. Again, 16% approve or find it acceptable to see content that's showing how a group of young men arrest refugees. So it's really interesting, because this type of behavior of initiatives, the vigilante activities certainly have some appeal to young people. Then we went to test also far-right activism readiness. This is the last highlight from the survey. Basically, we presented the respondents with 3 or 4 hypothetical scenarios. So in your area, a friend is inviting you to join a protest against Roma criminality, or is inviting you to join a vigilante group. Of course, it was framed appropriate for the age group and in the language they can easily understand. So we see that between 20 and 25% will participate in such an action, such as an anti-Roma protest or anti-migrant vigilantism. But then only 7% of all respondents would still stay and still participate after such a protest turns violent. And then we have between 8 and 9% of respondents saying, yeah, I will actively support in other ways such an initiative or a movement or a cause by promoting it, sharing it with others online or offline, or convincing others to join it. So based on all this data, we have delineated 2 what we call risk groups, which we want to work with in the campaign and which we want to target in the campaign. The first one, it's actually the easier one. We call them passive endorsers. Basically, we have a lot of demographic information on them. So they are the ones that to a greater extent approve far-right narratives. They are interesting because they show certain higher degree of political dissatisfaction, but then again, they are less informed about political issues. So they spend less time on getting informed on very important political things. We found that exposure to violence is linked to approval of far-right narratives. And here by exposure to violence, we mean if they have been passive or active participants in violence in their school or neighborhood, have they witnessed it, participated as perpetrators or as victims. So all of this we call exposure to violence. It does play a role. They show a greater exposure to violence. Then again, they are informed more by social media influencers. Naturally, they turn for advice, not for advice, but to form their opinion on important social and political topics and issues, not necessarily to their family and immediate social circle, but to social media influencers. Interesting for this group is also that they show a lower level of civic engagement. So we basically ask them, if you have seen a problem in your area that is of concern to you and affects you, have you undertaken anything to change it? And then we provided them with several options. So those are the ones that show a higher level of civic apathy, what we call. A few other psychological things we tested. They do have a higher level of external locus of control, but they still feel positive about themselves and about being accepted, having social support, and so on. So we find with this group, it's a bit more straightforward to work through an online campaign because, there's a lot of information we have of how to approach them. The second group we called the activists. Those are the ones that, to a great extent, approve violence, but are also in a hypothetical scenario more likely to say, yes, I would join a far-right violent action or initiative. So again, we have demographic information on them. They're the ones that engage more actively online with violent and hateful content. They also express political discontent, but they're more informed about politics. They spend more time. They're more interested in knowing, in reading the news. The difference here is that they have lower level of trust in family. They have, to a greater extent, a negative image of self and their social relationships. So looking at the very diverse questions we asked, we sensed a kind of a feeling of greater deficit in terms of belonging, wanting to feel part of a group, wanting to feel accepted. Again, violence plays a role here as well. And interestingly, this group of the so-called activists have a higher level of previous civic activism. So they have the need to channel frustrations, grievances through some sort of social action, be it really at a very practical level in their social surroundings. So based on this, we went on to working with a creative company, with communication specialists, with youth, with an organization that works with youth. We are now in the stages of, we developed actually alternative narratives and a campaign, online campaign. It's called Find Another Way. It's the slogan of the campaign, and it's really what the campaign is about. We have different objectives for this campaign because as we have seen, we have actually made a much more detailed account of the risk groups and their vulnerabilities, but I just presented the major two. So we have different needs, different deficits that we need to respond in different ways through communication. That's why we have these 4 phases: challenge, educate, inspire, and act, because it's not sufficient to challenge. We have seen some of the so-called vulnerable groups will be receptive to alternative viewpoints. They'll be open to their views being challenged and being presented with alternative views, but it's not enough. Some of them will want to engage and go a step further. So we want to provide different channels to do that, but in a positive way, such as a positive civic action, engagement, to have this empowerment to be able or to know how to achieve social change, no matter how small. It's inspiring. So that's why we have these 4 phases. And very important, and this is almost my last slide, we strongly believe this needs to be combined with the offline activities and offline initiatives. And here we're working with our partner, Safer Internet Center, which are very experienced in addressing issues such as internet bullying, youth being exposed to risks of pornographic content and all kinds of dangers in the online space. And we found that the trainings they do, because they're very interactive, training for teachers and then developing interactive lessons in school, they are very suitable to address this issue as well, because they first focus on building the essential life skills and competences in school, in this safe space where young people are given the opportunity to discuss these issues, to receive a floor to confront their viewpoints, but also to develop these skills like critical thinking, emotional intelligence, conflict management, digital literacy. And only then, once this is done, only then do we bring in the topic of the far right. What is propaganda? How to behave when you see something like that, how to be critical, and what are the dangers if you go down that path. So this is in a nutshell our campaign. Here just a few snapshots. Of course, we engage influencers that young people like and listen to and trust as ambassadors and messengers of our alternative narratives to be more authentic. We have animated videos, games, different creative content. And just to wrap this up, we have these are the links to the campaign. It's still in the making, so there'll be a lot more content coming in the next few weeks and months. Yeah, I think the survey will be also, the data will be published. I think it's very useful for us as well for our future work in research and radicalization. It provides us insights that we didn't have before. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosita, and thank you to all panelists. I'm conscious of the time. We don't have too long to go into questions, and I don't want to keep everyone too long, but it would be very nice. We've had a few very interesting questions that have come in. What I think I will, yeah, I'll start off with one question, and we'll see how time goes, and anyone is free to take this question up. In the last panel we had, a lot of the EU and round representatives were using the term lone actors quite significantly. Is this not a misleading term, given how mainstream right-wing extremism is in Central and Eastern European countries, and particularly as we've talked about in some of the presentations, discussions over state sponsorship? Perhaps I can open that up to Michael first.
Yeah, I think yes, it is a bit of a misnomer because it discounts sort of the political or otherwise socialization that a lot of these lone actors go through. I mean, thinking of some examples, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber in America, is thought of quite often as a lone wolf, but he was involved in a lot of far-right networks and attended far-right events before he executed his bombing. In Germany, the National Socialist Underground, composed of 3 terrorists working together in isolation, had earlier in the 90s, at the very start of the 90s, gone to all sorts of far-right demonstrations. So it may be that some actors, or actually the Christchurch shooter was connected with Martin Sellner in Austria. I mean, in most of these cases, I think there's plenty of evidence that these lone wolves were integrated into networks somehow, and that their violent act was individual, but in their preceding activity, they were engaged with the far-right scene.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add on this or come in?
Well, Lenka, do you want to go first?
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I would absolutely agree with Michael in terms of it's a very misleading term. And I just wanted to add onto that example with the Christchurch shooter, in the sense that even if you look at his manifesto, he's making inside jokes to the HN community, right? So there's a certain interplay here in terms of particularly how these online spaces, the Chan sphere, helps create these communities and identity building collectives that I think is often overlooked when it comes to understanding the very important role that online spaces can play in creating those shared spaces of belonging. So I absolutely agree the lone actor term can be quite misleading. I see its use primarily as a way to designate certain actors who engage in violence on an individual basis. So it may not necessarily be a collective effort in violence, but I mean, I still struggle to find a term sometimes in order to explain, how an individual's violent behavior can match with a certain terminology in how we might understand, their milieu of engagement.
Lenka?
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of smart things have been said before me. I would just add to that you know, even a lone actor engaged in a violent terrorist act inhibits a mental space. I used to use Breivik's PowerPoint presentation before I sort of thought it was too inappropriate, but it, you know, it's a long trend that definitely draws from a lot of ideas that are floating around. But I would like to also add that you know, the representatives of the European Union should consider the fact that if the European Union is not going to take mainstreaming of some radical ideas seriously, and you know, actions of many leading political representatives that are in the European Union that use identity politics and radical ideas to dismantle democratic institutions, we will really not, you know, we are not going to get very far. So, you know, the mobilization is on a spectrum when you have a lone wolf, but it really ends with state-sponsored, you know, states sponsoring polarizing discourses for political purposes, and there is a lot that can be done there. And I have to say that the European Union has, I don't think has been taking this very seriously, and it's complicit actually in some of the actions of, let's say, the Orban government and so on and so forth.
Okay,
so
thank you.
No lone wolves here.
Rosita, do you have anything to add at this point? Okay, moving on to some other questions as well. I was struck by Lenka during your discussion, some of the exploration of role that discussions over sexuality plays in Eastern European far right. This somewhat seems to conflict with some of the very strong anti-Islam messages that we've also been getting out of the far right in Eastern Europe, who have sort of posited themselves as being protectors of particularly of women and rights of women and freedom of women, in contrast to this essentialized idea of Islam and a foreign Islam. To what extent, how do you think those two sometimes conflicting frames exist together? And maybe you could comment a bit widely as well, because there's also various discussion. I mean, as Evian pointed out on anti-Semitism and really close relationship with Israel, how these competing frames are sometimes appropriated and exist.
So I'll just answer very briefly because we are running out of time. These, first of all, I think the anti-refugee mobilization is going down because the issue is less salient. But even if you think about Orban or the Slovak or Polish governments, a lot of these debates are framed as these countries being the Christian frontiers. This is especially important in Hungary, where you can sort of merge the defenders of the Christian faith defending Europe against sort of the Muslim horde. So I think that's the main compatibility there. I think that a lot of the anti-Islam mobilization has two components. One is ethnic, but I think a big element of it is via social conservatism. And even in Western Europe, you see, far-right movements embracing gender rights because they don't want to put their women in burqa. So you see very interesting new configurations that are really compatible. And in Slovakia, the far right is the best friend of Israel right now. So it's another, there are two far rights. One of them is yeah.
Thank you.
I would just briefly make a comment on the anti-Semitism versus Israel dynamic that you mentioned, Richard, because I think it's quite an important one. My response to that would be that there has been a long history of thought within the extreme right in supporting this ethno-pluralism concept. So it's the idea that those of a certain ethnicity are entitled to their own ethno-state. And so that's how we might be able to understand certain extreme right actors who are still vehemently anti-Semitic, but do support the state of Israel.
Thank you. I'm going to just give a final question now, and particularly kind of focus on Michael and Rosita for a response, looking at how to respond to far-right mobilizations. To what extent again, kind of going back to state sponsorship. How do we construct a response to the danger of the far right, taking into account the fact that there is state sponsorship, and how do we sort of, we don't quite have the same sort of mechanisms in place as we do in parts of Western Europe, for instance. And also, what are the dangers of, we've spoken a lot about ideology and these ideologies and views. What are the dangers of equating these ideologies with violence, and where do we draw the line, particularly with the far right? Maybe if I could ask Rosita first to comment on that.
Can you repeat, please, the second part of the question?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I think your presentation was a lot about views and viewpoints through the studies that you've done. How do we best respond to those, and particularly how do we delineate between far right violence and maybe far right views? Again, this old problem in CVE and CT. How do we respond to problematic views that aren't necessarily illegal?
Right. Yeah, very valid point. Well, the thing is, in Bulgaria, and I know in some other countries in the region as well, we don't even know how big it's the violent component of the far right. When you take, because people kind of say, okay, hate crime, is it like, yeah, it is part of it, and we don't really have a clear picture due to several reasons. Like, legislative framework does not allow to kind of disaggregate and have the bias component so that we can count statistic and have a real idea. Then you have underreporting of such acts. You have a lot of kind of a huge latency of this type of activities. So it's a very valid question, but for instance, in our research, in this particular research, we saw that definitely there is, although we didn't test actual behaviors, we test inclinations to behave in a certain way in hypothetical scenario, but there is a clear link that the more people engage with such content online, first uncritically, then it just, becomes acceptance, and then at some point becomes normalization of violence. So to me, as a person working between research and actual measures or prevention, it's not even that important that prevention has to be done, because there are already the warning signs. And secondly, I think specifically in Bulgaria, but in other countries from the region as well, we first need to have the data. How big is the problem? Because it's so severely underplayed. We have had for the past 5 years a lot of focus on Islamist radicalization, but when you look at the numbers, even we don't have exact numbers, the impact is bigger, and it has a greater potential to mobilize more young people than Islamist radicalization in Bulgaria in particular. So, and that will be my immediate response to that.
Thank you. Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Rosita makes some good points at the micro level and at individual behaviors, and I would absolutely echo the need for a greater monitoring infrastructure in certain countries. And then maybe something that Lenka said that I thought was quite interesting is that the EU is really absent in a lot of this. You have Germany banning far-right groups like this week, the Northern Eagles, the Nordadler group. But if that group just goes over the border, they have escaped the banning practices. Earlier this year, Germany banned Combat 18, but it's still massive and operative in Britain. And so with the transnationalization of far-right groups, the EU has to step up and get involved in this policy sphere. And that extends to countries that are tacitly encouraging or openly inviting far-right groups. And Lenka was quite right to say that the EU has been negligent at best, complicit at worst in countries like Hungary and Poland at times. So that's, I would say, one of the most urgent policy needs.
Good, thank you very much. With that call to action for the EU, I will end the debate. I'd love it to go on further, but unfortunately we have time constraints. But thank you very much, Michael, Lenka, Evian, and Rosita for your input. please join brave, mindful act champions and the Polish Platform for Homeland Security next week for our final RADPol 2020 workshop and panels, where we'll be looking at a multi-agency approach and joint action initiatives to tackling radicalization and violent extremism, as well as focusing in on gender and the role of gender beyond non-religiously justified extremism. Thank you very much, and I will hope to see you all next week. Thank you.